Hi, I'm Alex. I've just uploaded a video called Pro 1 Carpentry, which is my spin on a bit of John Carpenter and Alan Howarth style music. And this video is a real in-depth, under-the-hood look at how I put that together. So you obviously need to watch that video first, otherwise this isn't going to make a lot of sense. There's a link on the screen now. It's a very detailed and in-depth walkthrough, so there might be too much information for you. So what I've done is I've put the time codes in the description below, so you can jump to the section that's most relevant to you. If you just want to look at the synth programming, you can look at that. If you want to look at drum programming, you can jump to that. Or if you want to look at the mix, you can skip right to that bit. So let's dive in. Okay, so we've got Sequential Circuits Pro 1, which is an analog monosynth that was produced between 1981 and 1984. It was created by Dave Smith. He'd produced the Prophet 5, which is probably one of the most iconic synths of all time, which is incredibly similar to this, if you look at all the modulation and how the oscillators work. And they wanted to get it down to cost less than $1,000, which they did, but the way they did that was kind of had to make the build quality kind of cheap, and it's quite plasticky, and the keyboards are notoriously terrible and break. But the sound is fantastic, and the reason I use this synth is because John Carpenter used a Prophet 5 a lot and a Prophet 10 in his scores, and you can get very similar sounds out of this, particularly like the drones and bass lines and stuff that he did a lot of. So let's have a quick listen to the bass sound I got off it. So that's quite a cool sound. It's got a lot of bass on it, if you want it, which is always handy. So on oscillator A, I've got a square wave. You can set the footing of that. You can have a triangle wave instead. And there's pulse width on the square wave, so you find a place that you like it. Oscillator B, I've set that an octave up. You can set the footing differently, or you can tune the oscillators separate to each other, so you can have them in a different interval if you want. And I've also got that on a square wave, so there's the two together. And then I've got over here, I've set oscillator B to the wheel, and then I've sent the wheel and the LFO to the wheel, and then I've sent those both to the pulse width of oscillator B. So you can modulate the sound and get some of that kind of flangey effect, which is quite cool. With the actual bass part, started off with just a drone, like this. Then the next part we start moving up a bit. It's just a pentatonic thing. And then for the next section we move up. And so basically what I've done there is start off with one note, then on part 2 you then start coming up, and then for the final part you start coming up higher until you've got a bass line that's a full octave. Why would you want to do that? Well, this is what I talk about with your mix being 90% what your arrangement and what you put in. So as well as getting the sounds right, you want to have parts that step up. If you want there to be a change from one section to the next, like if there was a verse or a chorus, you've got to be doing something different in your part. Your part has to lift and change and be doing that. Otherwise, you can't put something into your track that's not there. So I've kind of got 3 stages there. I've got a single note drone, then I've got like this halfway octave section, and then I've got this full octave bass line. And then in the track, you feel the change from the bass because it's playing a different part for each section. Okay, so then we've got this other part that plays this. Now there's some specific things I'm doing there. The first thing that you can probably hear is I've tuned the oscillators to a perfect fifth. So you can just do that here. So that's the cool thing about having two separate oscillators. That you can tune independently. So that gives me like a kind of power chord thing. Now you can hear that wow wow. How am I doing that? Well, the Pro 1 has two envelopes. It has a filter envelope as well as your amplifier envelope. And if you play, you can mix it in here to the filter. And then if you play around with the settings of it, you can get that wow wow. So if I mess it up, take it all off, nothing. Then you can set that up. So that's playing around with the filter cutoff using a filter envelope. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to talk about is oscillator sync, which is this kind of sound. So it's that kind of breakwater, release the beast thing, which I think was done on a Prophet 5, in fact. So what the hell is oscillator sync? We can switch it on here, and basically it makes this oscillator a slave to this oscillator. And this oscillator's waveform is running along. I've got a triangle, and this one's running a square. And every time this oscillator returns to its starting point, it forces this oscillator to restart as well, regardless of where it is in its waveform. And that creates some kind of interesting... I've got some LFO here as well. But if you then tune this... and have some LFO on the mod wheel there, you get a really cool sound, which is it's almost a stereotype, that sound now, but it's a stereotype for a reason. It's because it's very cool, and getting the kind of attack and everything is done on the envelope, on the filter envelope here. Like that. Keyboard amount, that's the amount of keyboard voltage that is affecting the filter. I've brought that down because you can hear it makes it a bit too bright. And I wanted to dull the sound a little bit, especially when I'm playing up there. So I use that for the lead parts. That kind of thing, yeah. So that's another great feature of the Sequential Circuits Pro 1, which isn't always a feature on every synth you come across. So I expect the majority of you thinking, I can't afford a Pro 1, or I can't find a Pro 1, or I haven't got the space for a Pro 1, or all of the above, which is fair enough. So what are your alternatives? Well, there is a plug-in version that was made by Yuhi. They did the Prophet 5, which is the Repro 5, and they did the Pro 1, which is the Repro 1. If you're into hardware, you're in luck because Behringer announced that they are making a fully analog clone of the Pro 1, which is probably coming out later this year. Okay, so let's talk drums. On this one, I'm using an Oberheim DX, which is a digital drum machine from the early 80s. Oberheim made a DX and probably the more famous DMX, which is basically the same machine. It's just got more sounds. But they're both EEPROM machines, which means they were digital samples put on little EEPROMs which are inside, which you can change. And they're replayed, but because of the technology at the time, they're very crunchy. I think they're 8-bit samples, so have a little listen to kick drum. You can really hear how crunchy that is. And then snare, hats, and the open responds to the close. Toms, cymbals, shakers, and clap. But that's not it. You can tune these, which is what makes this Oberheim DX and the Lindrum that came before it, which was the first commercially available digital drum machine, so cool. I'll just do some tuning on the kick so you can hear what I mean. And the snare. And a bit on the clap as well. Now that's particularly useful, not just because you get super crunchy sounds when it's tuned down low, which is what Prince used to do a lot of the time with his LM1. He used to tune right down and get that real kind of sound. But it's super handy because you can tune it to the track that you're playing, which is exactly what I've done in this. So I'm going to tune the kick to an E. It's about there. And I'm going to tune the snare as well. And the toms I've already tuned the top tom to an E. The others obviously tune with it, so you have to go with that. Clap. That's actually conveniently on an E. So you've now got a drum machine that is in the key of the music you're going to record. So why would you want to do that? Well, it's kind of obvious, really. It's the same reason that you tune a piano or tune a guitar when you're playing in a track, and the same reason why you'd use consonant intervals, like on a piano. If you play octaves, the relationship between those two notes is an exact multiple. Each octave is twice as many cycles per second as the octave below, and so they're symmetrical and they sound good. Fifths also work, things like that. But if you to use a flat second interval, for example, the relationship is completely unsymmetrical and you get that rub and that dissonance. And if you don't tune your drums, you might have your kick drum, for example, hitting a pitch which is a semitone or a tone or something out with the track, and it doesn't sound as good. So this is all about getting your sounds to sound right at the input stage. Because your mixing really is only about the last 10% of your sound. I would say about 90% of what you do is your arrangement, what the parts are playing, and how they're set up and tuned and recorded. Okay, so programming a DX. First thing we do is we go to an empty slot. I'm going to use number 5 because I used the other ones before for some other beats. I think there's 99 on there. You set the length, so 1 bar, 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars. I think each one can be up to 99 bars as well. So I'll set that. Tempo, I've got it at 125, which is where I had it before, but you can tap in whatever tempo you want there. Signature, first thing it gives you is what kind of click it's going to give me, and it's going to give me 1/8, which is quaver or an eighth note. And then the time signature, you can change it there. I've got it 4/4. I did do a section in the middle which was in 7/4, so you can do that. That's fine. Quantize. Now you can set it to quantize to whatever you want here. I'm going to set it to eighths or quavers because the beat I did was just quavers. There was not even any sixteenths. And then we're ready to go. So we're going to hit record and play. And off it goes. And the next time around, I'm going to put the kick drum in first. And there it is. It's all quantized for me. Put the snare in. Okay, let's do some hats. Pretty terrible playing, but it quantizes it for me. Let's do some toms. At the moment, I've got this connected so every output is coming into a different input in Cubase. So that actually then disables these and you mix. Originally, that would have been intended to go into a mixing desk and then you do the leveling there. So once you've used the direct outs, these don't actually do anything. But if you use the mono or stereo outs, then these do alter the sound, so alter the levels. The reason I didn't do the stereo outs, I recorded it the first time with stereo outs, and the DX by default has some weird stereo panning that I don't like. The snares to the left, the kicks slightly to the left, and then the hats are another way, and then the toms are spread. So then for recording this, although you can set a tempo on it to 125, 125 on a DX isn't the same as 125 in my DAW in Cubase. You often find a clock and another clock are not always the same thing. So I'm using a BeatStep Pro over here by Arturia. So you can use MIDI out, and thankfully a DX, this model of DX has by-standard MIDI clock in. So you can send a clock to it from a BeatStep Pro. So I'm controlling it from the BeatStep. And then with the BeatStep, you can set the sync mode up the top here. I can't quite reach around everything. To USB, which means it's getting its clock from your DAW. So you can get the clock from the DAW to the Arturia BeatStep Pro, and from the BeatStep Pro, that will then pass it on to the DX. And that's what I did, so that I was starting the DX at the part of the track where I wanted it, and so it was clocked. Okay, so let's take a look at the mix. As you can see, I've got things in folder tracks, like drums here. So I've grouped all similar instruments together. I've got Pro 1 bass parts in blue, I've got the kind of middly riff parts in purple, and then I've got the top lines, melodies and things, and sequences in red, then some guitar at the bottom. And these all come down to these group tracks. I've got 2 drum tracks, 3 Pro 1 tracks, guitar and MS-20, and then I've got 2 effects tracks, just a reverb and a tape delay, which I'll get onto in a little bit. So let's have a look at drums. These are the raw DX recordings here, sound like this. And all I've got on there is on individual drums and sounds. I've got a send here, and that's just going to the reverb, and it's different amounts dependent on what I wanted. So more on the toms, more on the cymbals, less on the clap and snare, and none on the kick. I don't want reverb on the kick. And those come down here to this track. I've got the tiniest bit of EQ just to brighten up the top end, just make it shine a bit more and cut through a little bit more. Very nominal. And then I've got this compressor on it, which is an SSL bus compressor from Waves. The reason I've used this compressor is the drum sounds that come off a DX are quite compressed, as you can see, which is due to the way that they're a drum machine and they're sampled and the dynamics are pretty flat. So I didn't want to use a compressor that kind of drove or crushed it too hard, so I've just used something that's quite transparent. Very light, isn't it? And that's just to level it off just that tiny little bit, but so you can't hear it. And then layered in, I've got some samples from the original LM1, which I was using when I was kind of mocking up this track early on, and I've then put the DX in, but I like some of these sounds, I've kept them in there, particularly sounds the DX hasn't got, like cowbell. There's a clap layer, a snare layer, and some tom layers, and tambourine, and a casaba. And those are going to a Lin channel, which has absolutely nothing on it at all. But layered in, works quite well. Just come over to a bit where it's a bit fuller. Very simple drum part. I was going for the John Carpenter type thing. He used an LM1 on his soundtracks in the early 80s, like Escape from New York. And so those are very similar sounds, and some of them are in fact identical sounds, the LM1. Let's have a look at the reverb here that's on it. So I've actually EQ'd the reverb. That's something that's really important and easy to forget. The bottom end of reverb, I find, is just a big washy, muddy mess, so just filter it out. It's easy to forget to EQ your effects. And it's this past to future Lexicon tape impulse, which is very 80s and really cool. And then the delay here is the Yuhi Satin. It's an emulation of tape delay, but I'm just using the reverb on drums, and that's it. And let's go down. The Pro One, here's the bass part, and I talked when I was showing you putting this part together about the consistency of your bass part and the thickness of it. It's the foundation of your sound, the bass, so you want to get it as meaty and as chunky as possible at the input stage rather than try and fix it in the mix, because you'll never get it the way you want it. And as you can see, that is solid, really thick, really consistent. It's got some modulation and the sound changes. Have a little listen. It's very thick. And it just sits with the drums. And that's what you want. You don't want to be having to do loads to try and get those to sit together. You want to have done all that at the input stage, and that's all working nicely. There's this other little part, the bass part, where it goes into a little drone. Let's go to the drums. Little pulse part as well. Let's move on down, and we've got these fifths parts, just kind of riffs. And we start off, we've got one pan to the right. I've taken some of the top off there. I've just poked through the mix a little bit too much. And then later on, I've got a double track of that to the left. See, I've done a bit of EQ on that. Play that one on its own. Slightly different sounds so that they blend together. And then coming down here, a little bit of compression on them. Very light, you just want to be tickling that. Building up your gain in stages. And again, just a bit of reverb on there. Very simple. But you can hear it's just all sitting together. So I've got it right on the input stage, and on the programming stage, and on the part playing and arranging. So you're just really not having to do much in the mix because you want to get it right on the way in. So yeah, you can just hear everything. Bringing this top part, you can hear that really clear, and that's because they're occupying different parts of the frequency range by design. So you've got the bass is obviously low end, drums are in tune with them, we tune them to E so they work and they're punctuating the sound. The fifths riff sounds are kind of mid-range, and then this stuff's right at the top end, so they all get out of each other's way and sit together, which is what you want to try and do. Here's some of these sequences which I put in using a BeatStep Pro. So we've got the high one. That one, and then there's these two in the middle. And that's got a bit of the tape delay on it, you can hear. Both of them have, in fact. Panned out quite wide. Yes. And then this one's in the middle. So we've got like middle, left, right. And those work together. And I've only used those in the middle when these have dropped out. So you can see I'm making holes in the arrangement. When the fifths kind of riff has dropped out, then we get this in its place. Then when the fifths come back in, these get out of the way. They don't come back apart from the very high one. So that's all about your arranging and making space for things. The sync lead has got reverb and delay on it, and no plugins. Doesn't need it. It's thick sound, as you can see by the waveform. And then we've got this little bit of Korg noise stuff. So I use the BeatStep Pro for that as well, to get that in time. So if you listen to the drums with it, it's working like a little rhythm. It's just a bit of a different sound. And at the end, it does get a little bit thicker. I've got an extra part that's just doubling the bass line, actually. Complement each other. So that's why I put that in there. It's just a little extra higher part just to help bring the bass out in the last chorus when it's getting a bit fuller. It's just a little double there. We get this harmony at the end, so as well as this melody, third above, and then a fifth above on the MS-20. Slightly different sound. And they really sing together, and I've just automated some volume there just to blend and sit things. So I've got the main melody in the middle, the third above to the right, and the fifth above to the left. And they've just got a bit of reverb and delay on them. Dead simple, but you can hear all of it, listen. All working nicely. Guitar, really simple. In probably another video on another track that's more guitar heavy, I'll do some more guitar focused stuff, but this is just one part to the left and then doubled with the part. It's a bit drier, slightly to the right, but really it's supposed to sound just like one guitar, really. Light compression, really not doing much. Cut the bottom end off, high pass filter. Don't really want low end on a guitar. And it's got a bit of reverb on it. And it's just all about getting a steady take, consistent playing in time, and consistent dynamics. You can really hear when it comes in. without a doubt, it's sitting in the mix, the range it's playing in, and the sound of it, and where it's sat in the mix. That's all working together nicely. So let's just have a look at the mix bus on the out. I've brought the level down here because while I'm recording this voiceover talking to you, you wouldn't be able to hear me, so normally I'd have that back up, but it's just Wolf compressor. I've got a bit of parallel compression. So it's bringing the level down with it on. And that's just very light compression, parallel compression, a mix of uncompressed and compressed signal, tiny bit of wow and lo-fi, which just takes off a little bit of the brightness. And you can see I brought the output down, so it's slightly quieter with it on than without, and just a moderate amount of compression. And that's it for the mix. That really is all there is to it. Okay, so let's talk about mastering. So what I've done when I've got the mix how I wanted it, at the end of the chain I've stuck T-racks on there, which is what I use for mastering. Again, the level is down so you can hear me talking right now, but normally that would be up at 0 dB for the mastering. And let's just take it off so you can hear the difference. Let's get to a fuller part of the track. So obviously quite a big change in level, so that's coming from the compression and limiting here. So first of all, I've got this emulation of a Pultec vintage EQ, and that's just doing the tiniest little bit of a scoop in the lower mids, a tiny bit of boost high up, about 12k, and then a tiny bit of attenuation just above that. So it's just very subtle settings. If I just bypass it, a very small amount, but it's working in conjunction with this EQ. So I've put a high pass at 40 Hertz, and you might be thinking, what? You can hear down to 20 Hertz, and you can if your ears are good enough, but that 40 to 20 bit at the bottom tends to be rumble and mud, and it's actually helps the bottom end of your mix if you just scoop it down a little bit, I find. Then we've got the kind of classic scoop in the middle, which is your kind of smile curve. You just want, I've only pulled off 2 dB. If you're having to pull 3+ dB, then something's wrong with your mix. If you're doing 6 dB boosts or cuts or something, something's very wrong. And that's just around 1K, but it's a very wide Q, so it's pulling out a broad, rather than a notch, it's pulling out a broad scoop in the middle, and then it's just got a little bit of boost, again broad, from 7K at the top. If I bypass both EQs, just brings in that kind of smoothness, just takes a little bit of the mids out, and brightens the top and just cleans up the bottom, so it's not doing anything drastic. On the compression, I've just brought the level up a bit. With the input drive, I've got a low ratio, 1.92. Stereo enhancement, I mean, you can make it really wide or really narrow. Nice to add a very small amount. Attack and release, you just find the points where you can't hear it. You don't want to hear it suddenly squash back really quickly, and a slightly longer release time tends to be more transparent, and then that's just hitting into a limiter at 0 dB. Pretty standard stuff, and that's it. And so that's it. That's my walkthrough of my little experimentation with a bit of carpentry. I hope this long walkthrough was helpful. I'm going to start doing a bit more of this. When I uploaded my big fat guide to using a virtual orchestra, it got a really good response, and I think the penny dropped that if I share music, some people are interested in it. If I share music and talk about how I make it, it becomes a two-way street and it's more relevant to you guys. So if it's useful, let me know. If it's not useful, let me know, because I won't put the effort into making them. And if you enjoyed this, please hit like, and if you want to see more of it, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.